Hi, folks. Today is like a really bad day. Uh, it's a family in the UK who've been trying for years to get their children back. It's a tough case. When they contacted me, that already several years had passed, and and they've been, filing applications and appealing, and they've lost their leave application for leave to appeal to the Supreme Court. um, it's just such a horrible system. The law itself is designed to give all the discretion to the social workers, and the trial court treats the social worker not as an adversary in the matter, but as an expert. And the parents are, very, very poorly educated. Typically the kind of family who's affected by this, no access to any lawyer. I mean, there is legal aid, but those legal aid lawyers, they just don't, they really don't do a good enough job. It's, you know, legal aid is really nothing like what you see in private practice. I'm sure that there are some, shining diamonds, but that's the exception. And frankly, even in private practice, there are areas where you get really focused and very, very good lawyers, and there are areas where you just don't have such good lawyers, like high stakes criminal matters, big corporate matters, certain types of matrimonial litigation, human rights matters. You'll get really top class lawyers, but like petty crime and in England, these public family law matters. The lawyers, I mean, they're just not that great. They're not top of the grade. I mean, nobody graduating from law school who's a star performer is even looking at these jobs. And then those who do, I suppose, like in any matter, I mean, you represent either side. You could represent a company or a shareholder or a consumer. And so similarly, if you're in the child services area, you could represent child services authorities one day, you could represent parents the other day. And um, I mean, like, often what happens is that you just have such a long standing relationship with the local authority, even when you're appearing for parents, that parents just feel that they don't get the best, and and they don't. But even with the best of lawyers, what has happened in the child protection system in the UK over the years is that the laws are designed in a way that they really restrict the scope for anyone, in the system, the judges in the court system, to really intervene. And so, for example, if you want to appeal a decision from the trial court and you go to the High Court or the Court of Appeal, there's a two-stage. At the first stage, you apply for leave to appeal and you have to state your grounds. And then it's up to the High Court to decide whether they'll allow your appeal and which of the grounds they'll allow. And so you get restricted already at that stage. If your leave to appeal is rejected, you can try for it to be you can't really appeal that, and if you are lucky enough to get through the High Court and you still don't get a verdict in your favor, you have to apply to the Supreme Court for leave to appeal, and then you can only apply to the Supreme Court if you've gone through the High Court and on the grounds which the High Court allowed. So the scope for litigating the matter keeps narrowing and narrowing. And I mean, the whole idea of having a three-stage court system where there's a trial court, an appeal court, and a Supreme Court is that you should have the ability to litigate to get a substantive hearing in three stages. That's what the meaning of a right of appeal is. But this right of appeal was, it was severely curtailed. That they took a decision that, there are some matters that can't go to the Supreme Court at all. And this all of this family law, the child protection services law is coming under that. And I mean, they've done really drastic things. There's something known as the inherent jurisdiction of the court to do justice, and they've actually, by statute, removed that from the courts, and given certain powers to the local authority. And you know if you the thing is that, like, you have a child protection system which has less checks and balances and less rights to people who are saying that they've been wrongly accused of something, then you have for terrorists and rapists and murderers. That doesn't make any sense. And I mean, of course, one knows this, but every time one sees yet another heartless, unjust, judgment coming from the UK courts, it just hurts all over again. It's so cruel on the families. One thing is clear, that no one in the system cares for the children. Everybody is behaving in a very technical manner. Oh, well, these are your grounds available and you can't raise this ground now. It's all, it's so technical. It's as if you're dealing with things and not with people, with children. There's this Section 1 of the Children Act UK, that the welfare of the children is paramount. But it never is. That's just a phrase that is repeated to justify sticking by whatever decisions the social workers have taken and have told the trial court is what it should be. And it took a while for the law to become this sort of stacked up against parents. And it's very strange. I mean, this anomaly that this has been developed, by people who see themselves as rights activists, as voices for civil society, as people intervening on behalf of individuals who can't speak for themselves. This is completely against the grain for the kinds of transparency, accountability, gentleness, and compassion that they advocate for. The whole idea, the movement against capital punishment, for instance, even for the worst of crimes. It comes from a position where people who espouse that view believe that we as a society always should respond with gentleness and with compassion, even when it is stretched to the extreme by horrendous behaviors and horrendous crimes. And that when we see something that we think is heinous, we should always take responsibility for it ourselves to a certain degree, because the criminal behavior that you see in others has to do with social dynamics for which each of us is responsible. That's the whole rationale. And yet these same people have worked so hard and to make the child protection system almost watertight against the decisions of the social workers and the local authorities. And you would think that, well, maybe this is because they are so concerned about children. But then, it's very strange that it's targeting only, people who are poor and powerless in some way. Life is so much on display these days. All right, there are really no taboos. But you just a lot of people say, well, this has to deal with drug abusing parents and alcoholics and people who are jobless. But drug use and alcoholism and, that's there in all levels of society in the West. I mean, by women as well as men, these people openly get not only to keep their own children, but also to adopt children that are taken away from other parents, from poor parents by the child protective system. So, I mean, I don't understand this schizophrenia. I mean, the behavior which is almost encouraged and celebrated. You're expected as a celebrity at school to do drugs and have this lifestyle, and it's really weird. You read some of these judgments describing the parents, and they where, of course, the cases which I have done, there's been not even any, the drugs are not even in the scene. Okay, these are lower middle class to working class Indian immigrant families. They haven't yet gone into that culture, but the way they read almost Victorian in the strictness and all about these things. But then how come the same yardstick is not being applied to middle class and upper class families in these places? And what's interesting in England is that a lot of these laws, they are spearheaded by people with titles. Like you'll suddenly see Lord so and so and Baroness so and so, and I mean, of course, not all lords and barons, I reckon, nowadays, come from are born into the upper classes these days in the UK. But either way, I mean, there's a lot of support from the establishment for all of this. And the only explanation that I can think of is that, I mean, because I'm struggling to come to terms with why is this happening? I can't see it merely as some kind of anomaly, because if it was just, something that went wrong by oversight or whatever, it would have been corrected by now. But I think that, I mean, it is an expression of a lot of anger against the institution of the family. And that is why people support it without even knowing anything about it, because I think that you only come to this point, you only have these laws in societies where the collective consciousness has been so hurt by the institution of the family, by parents. They have such bad, bleak memories of any kind of family life, whether it's siblings or mothers or fathers, that they don't believe that it deserves the benefit of the doubt. And the evidence is that there is a lot to there is a lot to there's a lot of evidence that this is what's going on, subconsciously. All right, because in the West and in westernized societies, even in places like India, this. The idea that that the parent has really wronged you as a child, and this has effects for your well-being and for many things that happen to you, that your reactions, your feelings when you grow up as an adult. This is very much ingrained. It's part of the whole ideology of modern life. And I think that it's not just I mean, of course, that's what Freudian analysis and all is all about that. But there are a lot of people. Not everyone has read Freud, or is that is like even if the all of society were Freudian, that's like an intellectual espousal, and an intellectual espousal always listens to reasons why that could be right or wrong. This is a much more emotional reaction. So I think that what is going on here is that there is a genuinely emotional felt experience of hurt and rejection towards parents. And I think that this is sort of characteristic of modern societies, and it comes for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think that one of the things is that in modern life, where you're sort of prepared to be the citizen of a democratic country and to be an independently earning citizen, you're prepared for one of the professions. All of family life is really it's just a holding ground for that stage when you will be this independent individual who's fulfilling their aspirations and productive and able to take care of themselves. And this makes the home, and especially childhood, a rather bleak sort of place. There are many consequences for this. I mean, I don't know if this is the right time to go into this, but childhoods in more traditional families, where all the focus is not on making you enter into a profession. And I use the word profession. I'm not saying enterprise. Business. Entering into a family business, entering into a family a family practice like folk art or something. That's a whole that's a whole different atmosphere to being prepared to enter a profession. And I think that there's just much less affection and warmth. There's a lot of stress on your achievement in terms of all the skills that you need in order to perform well as a professional in the future. Everything revolves around school, and you're not getting the kind of affection from your you're not you're not able to get the kind of presence and time from your mother, because your mother is also a professional and she's got other constraints on her. And a lot of modern parenting is all about how you're going to help your child adjust to the fact that you're not going to be present all the time, to the fact that they need as early as possible to be independent, so that you as a the parents can go and rejoin their professional life to the fullest extent, and other things. And um, the result is, I mean, this is not always done selfishly. A lot of people just feel compelled, and also the economic arrangement is such that in some countries it may just not be feasible to actually give your children a good life if you only have a single income family. So this is not this is not a critique of double income families or working mothers, but the result is that there is a lack of affection and warmth and a sense of security. And I think that a lot of children maybe this massive internalized resentment which has built up over a couple of generations, because the thing is that of course it's an unequal relationship. I mean, the parent has makes all the decisions, and the child is subject to the will of the parent. And I think that a lot of affection, a lot of solidarity, a lot of companionship tempers that, and makes it palatable. And so you may not see the same kind of division between the generations, the same kind of resentment in teenagers, in traditional families, that you see in modern families. And I think there are many other things also, because it's not just so that's about childhood. But what also happens in the teenage years is that we think of ourselves as a more and more free and liberal society, but what we do to teenagers is actually very, very oppressive and restrictive. They are it is many years after they attain full intellectual and sexual and reproductive maturity that they are allowed to actually enter into gainful work, that they are allowed to actually have a family, that they are allowed to even engage in sexual intercourse. Technically speaking, all of this is pushed way beyond the age when they are ready for it, and when this is part of what they need to have a fulfilled life. Now, the thing is that if you're going to simply divide the lifespan into childhood and adulthood, which is what modern life does, you confront a lot of this becomes a huge problem, because a young adult or a young teenager, even an older teenager, may not have the full spectrum of growth and experience and maturity required in order to enter into these relationships and do this work and gratify all these desires in a way that is best for themselves and for society. I mean, this is a problem actually for all societies. Okay, I mean, they have traditional societies have tried to solve it by having early marriage and early entry into the professions. Or whatever. I mean, none of this is entirely satisfactory or really solves the problem. But in modern society, this is not even acknowledged as a problem. Okay, I mean, we just assume that we are giving so much to our teenagers by not forcing them to marry, by not forcing them to take up any job, by leaving it to their choice as to whether they will study or not, by in college, by letting them take college as a phase where they can experience everything, drugs and so on and so forth. And we think that we act as though there isn't a problem, but there is a problem. Okay, I mean, it's not fair that we are not allowing people of a certain age and capability to express that. And the fact that we let them play around in school and college, it doesn't do that's only a distraction. That's not solving the problem. Okay, I mean, you can be a really enthusiastic, aspiring medical student, but about from the age of 14 or 15, if you're biologically ready for many things, and more than that, you're emotionally ready for many things. And animals, actually, mothers drive their babies away after a certain age, and I think it's the same. Teenagers, I don't think they were meant to live in this claustrophobic environment with just the parents in one house, not being able to have their own money. So I think that there's a lot of resentment which builds up from that period as well. And the what I find really ironic is like this whole justification of child protection services, because mothers are druggies, or that couples have these serial monogamy, there's no stability in the home. Yes, but we teach young people these values in college. I mean, this is what my own personal experience as well. This is my whole generation and the 60s, and that's what they fought for. So, you're sort of eulogizing a particular type of behavior up to a certain age, and then after that, you're punishing for it. How does this make any sense? And I'm not here to say, I'm not, this is not there shouldn't be any drugs, or there shouldn't be any premarital sex. This is not, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you're endorsing, encouraging, and nurturing a certain type of behavior up to a certain age. And after that, suddenly it's, it's so horrible that you can just lose your children in this way. And, that is what's happening. This is the thing. If you're middle class, you can even be a drug addict and you can still end up having a productive life. Okay, because the reason why middle classes are so successful is that there's such a huge network. You can have the most third-rate family, but you'll be going to a school where other people will have good families, and you'll be able to see stable. When I say good, I just mean stable. Okay, so you'll have an example of this. You won't live in a society where there's just only single mothers who got pregnant at 14. Okay, and you'll go to a school which even with the most rotten and neglectful parents, it'll be relatively okay. At least classes will be held every day, and it only takes actually one. Children are so receptive to positive reinforcement, and that really is God's gift to them. And this is also how children who are snatched away from their moms and dads in the foster care system into the foster manage to survive, because children will respond to a positive thing. It's like a flower turns to the sun. So even one good teacher who can inspire you, steady you, can just save your life if you're middle class. Okay. So these kind of people, it's not a total disaster, I suppose, even when they take their addiction or laziness or whatever other quality into adulthood, into parenthood, into marriages, into cohabitation with, with someone for a life partner. But these things are really disastrous in a, situation where already the social network is precarious and you don't have any resources to draw on. But, this cannot be a justification for treating people in the welfare and the lower classes differently for the same behavior elsewhere. I mean, I think that it's a big mistake, and to set this horrible example for society where you can just have a wild time until you're about 20, 21, and then suddenly it all has to change. I mean, if you are an aspiring corporate lawyer, okay, and after your 1 year being a hippie and smoking up in Manali and Goa, you're going to be earning tens of thousands and pounds within a year and millions of pounds within 5 to 6 years. You then have an incentive to stop everything and clean your act up. But the other people don't have that incentive. And so these are the things that we need to start thinking about. And so this is what's going on in the West. How did these same laws come to India? This is what just astonishes me. Okay, who brought them here? And it's the same thing. Like, okay, so in India, we have like a third generation of feminist activists coming up. But I want to talk about the first generation of feminist activists. Okay, they all were very, very upper class ladies. They came from very, very cultured, well-off families, all of that. they usually had some great talent other than, like they were either a great dancer or great writer or great actress or a great politician or something. Okay, they had some quality which gave them, like this ability to stand on, to really wow people and stand on their own 2 feet and get the support from society, even if they didn't get it from their families. And very often, like, they had dumped their husbands, they really resented being married at 16 or whatever. From their point of view, they had unsupportive families who repressed them, who repressed their personality, and they were huge believers in women's liberation and all that kind of thing. And I mean, which is fine. I suppose ultimately everybody reacts from whatever experiences they have. But the impetus for a lot of these, and they spearheaded, all the laws and the systems which then, kept evolving over time to now what you see of child protection laws in India. And so, it's the same as what I suspect has been happening in Europe, which is that, these are women with such a, they've got a grudge. Okay, they are angry with what happened to them. They are angry with the institution of the family. They are angry with their fathers for not allowing them to marry the man that they fell in love with. They are angry with their mothers for, scolding them for, trying to be free or whatever. They are bitter about it. And, they see, like, they were also such talented and extraordinary women that that society and the world would have been poorer if they had not been allowed to do what they did. But, I grant all of that. But the fact of the matter is that this whole point of view comes from a place of deep hatred and bitterness. All right, and which has made it blind to all the problems with this structure that they thought that they had dreamt up. I mean, if you wanna intervene in society, that's great that you're thinking about what's wrong, but you also have to have a much a much wider view of all the different things that are connected with the one thing that you are angry about. And when you want to change that, you have to you're still blowing a hole in a system, so you're going to have to think of what you have to do so that it doesn't so that that hole gets filled up or completely. You can't just like have you can't put a little pole there and say that now you're done. See, if it is true that the family as an institution is totally rotten, and that the natural, children are liable to being completely, neglected, beaten up, whatever, in the family, then this is not a problem that you're going to be able to solve from child protection services. Because if family values have deteriorated, or if they never existed to that extent, when you take away children from one family and give it to another, whether it's an adoptive family or a foster family, you have the same risk that you would face in that family as well. So, if you genuinely have this problem, then you have to think much harder about what is it that is making families so rotten. What is it that, because, I mean, because of like so much talk of overpopulation, there's this idea that people could not help having children earlier. In order to gratify their sexual desires, they had to have children. And, so that's why that's why they had children. Okay. But, it's not like that. Birth control does not require too much technology, any technology. And you can control the number of children that you have, and it's always been the case. Okay, people had children because they wanted to have children. Okay, people had children because they wanted to have children, and it was a natural instinct in spite of all the well, I mean, one is taught, because I'm also brought up as a modern woman, that, all the sacrifice you make for your children. But that's not even the case. It's like life becomes meaningful when you have children. And in the same way that life becomes meaningful when you have friends, and life becomes meaningful when you have some kind of occupation that that absorbs you. And so having children is one of the things that gives meaning to our lives as humans. Now, if we are turning in on our children, then that means that something has gone really wrong. I mean, we weren't having children for so many billions of years just because we had to, and because we were actually pursuing sexual gratification. I mean, that's just absurd. Okay, so if it is the case that families are rotten, then you have to think much harder what is making them rotten. You cannot just say we're going to have this like elite police force. It's like we're going to have this elite child police force which is going to solve the problem. It's not. And this situation that we have today of having a completely fascist system, a completely authoritarian system that really is at this point is just operating like all rotten bureaucracies operate. They are the justification for themselves, and it's true that they still don't they go after masses and masses of children. They don't. But when they do, this whole system slams down on you. So we have to all these, so I was talking about feminists in India, and then there was a second generation, okay, who were actually given much more freedom than their mothers were. And most of them, they entered into, they studied, they got graduate degrees, and they went into some profession or the other. Most of them, they experienced a kind of working life for a few years before marriage, which has absolutely no comparison with the stresses of working life today. Okay, so they are great advocates for modernization and all of that, but they have no idea. And they are also great advocates of love marriage. Okay, but they have absolutely no idea what it is like to be out there on the marriage market, wanting to find a man or a woman to settle down with, and how brutal the whole dating scene is, how everyone is commitment phobic. I mean, everyone is commitment phobic until they find the one that they really love, and then it doesn't work out, and it's just so much wasted energy. And so like all these great freedoms and all, they all carry a price. And that second generation of women in India, they were very naive and also very spoiled, because they didn't really have the pressure on them to perform. They went into whatever job that was interesting to them. A lot of them went into arts and crafts, and all this human rights, reproductive rights, which is fine. That's a very, very meaningful work. I also do some work in that, but the point is that it's nothing like the what professionalization demands. And this idea that they were suddenly breathing the airs of freedom, and therefore the family and it's all rotten and all, it just comes from a wrong place. It comes from a place of ignorance, and from not actually having had to pay the price for what you were doing. The ones who are paying the price are the daughters and granddaughters of this line of second generation feminists of India. Now we have a third generation, okay, where you have education has spread much more. You have first generation university goers, young men and women from the small towns coming into the cities, into the big universities, doing really well. And they actually, it's interesting because they in their universities, in the cities, they get the kinds of freedoms and respect, a place in life that is actually not permitted to them in the home. Okay, and so they are straddling these two worlds. And as young people, I mean, you don't have to use your imagination much to see how, I mean, this entry into these universities and this new culture must be like as if to say the locks of the gate have been thrown open and the light is flooding in, and so they are, even bigger, and more robust, votaries of all of these freedoms and all than the previous ones. And there's a real bite to it because they are facing the edge. I mean, they are under pressure from their moms to marry. They are under pressure from their dads to take whatever work it is that the dads think. And so, I mean, it's impossible to argue with these people because it's so emotional and personal for them. And so now, so you've got this is where the support for these child protection services and this whole way of looking at child rights comes from in India. It basically comes from a place of great hatred towards the family and of a rejection of the past. Okay, now what is the answer? All right, so far as that's concerned, I don't have the answer. No one does. Okay, there's always injustice, and you have to fight against injustice in general, and in your personal case, you have to figure out a way that's truthful to you. Okay, that's all fine. But you cannot only look at that. You can't be fixated by that and put in systems thinking that, well, I'm going to bring in a state-sponsored, watertight system that's going to free the next generation of Indian boys and girls from the authority of their parents. Okay, this is wrong. It's wrong for this. I mean, I'm going to lose whatever 2 Indian audience that I have here. I'm going to lose you. But that kind of attitude is as wrong as what the Hindutva faction is doing to India today. Okay, you can have whatever grouse, grudge, point of view, personal experience, historical experience. It has its own place. You can argue it out, but you're just trying to, shut out another point of view. You are assuming the worst, of your adversary. You're, like that's what leads to grave injustice. You can't do it like that. You can't come from a place of hate. You have to come from a place of understanding. And this false dichotomy that has been built up in our universities and by these naive feminists between the past and the present, between the present and the future, between childhood and adulthood, between being single and between being married, between having children and not having children, between being a working mother and being a stay-at-home mother. These are all false dichotomies. It's a wrong way of looking at the problem. And we've had 3 generations of this temper tantrum, and it's got to stop. It's got to stop. The ugliness of what I'm witnessing in this child protection system is just not worth it. It's not worth it. I mean, I'm really sorry for your own personal fight with your families. Okay, whatever feeling you have, but you cannot replace one injustice with another one. Especially, you can't have a system that is gratifying your subliminal feelings of parental rejection or neglect or bullying, over authoritarianism. You can't sublimate that with this system, which will never touch you, because the people who are thinking in this way, they are all basically middle class, and this is not going to touch you. It's not fair that all of this should be dumped on people who don't even espouse this point of view. This is the irony that this system is attacking that at least among Indians, that part of society which is the most close knit and family friendly, and that's what they live for. You may think that they are stupid to do it, but they do, and this system shouldn't be applied to them at all. And it shouldn't be applied to anyone at all. Okay, in the West, we just don't, you guys don't have enough of a sense of what is going on in white society. I'm sorry. You just don't. You've got to look at it again. It wasn't just Hitler and the Nazis. It's the whole, you have to understand everything about the West. And, embedded in, like for the East, okay, embedded in the genius of any civilization are also the seeds for its destruction. And every age has its own idea of justice, but within that, those ideas of justice is embedded the seeds of the worst injustice. Okay, so we and we know all this stuff. All right, we have to come back to this understanding, which requires that you have to let go of this very personal animus that guides and dictates everything in the child rights sector. You have to let go. You have to take a much longer view. And you have to understand very basic things. The reason why the world chose democracy is that there was a deep experience and understanding of the fact that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that the whole idea of democracy is to have checks and balances and to have a pervasive skepticism towards the state and all its arms. And we have to go back to that. We have to stick to that and cling to it when we look at any of these welfare interventions, in particular the child protective system. Okay, and this whole talk, all right, there isn't a single person in the child rights movement that I can think of in the US, in the UK, in Norway, that has the ability to actually understand and take on board what I'm saying, okay? This whole lecture is addressed to just a few people. Number one, Dr. Shanta Sinha, who brought this child welfare system into India. She was the first chairperson of the National Commission for the Protection of Child Rights. I am saying this to you, okay? Then the other one is Harsh Mandar. Well, I mean, these are the two people, and then there's Loveleen Kakkar, who was the secretary for the Ministry for Women and Child Development when all these laws were brought in. You know, I'm talking to you because you have to understand the horror that you have invited into India. This is not a good system. You have to reassess. And you guys who pushed for it, you're the ones who are going to have to make a change. I mean, there are other people in the whole child rights business. They don't count for anything. Now I've seen you are the people who could exercise some leadership and some sense here. All of you, well, I don't know about Loveleen Kakkar, but certainly for Shanta Sinha and Harsh Mandar, you're well known for your belief in liberal and secular values. Okay, your careers have been about that, and you must apply that part of your belief system to what you have advocated for the child protection system. You absolutely must. This is something that you owe the generations below you. Because believe me, in India, okay, this, and we already saw it happen in Shaheen Bagh when the Supreme Court judge started suo moto issuing notices about why should children be brought to these protests. In India, this is going to be used to attack religious minorities, okay? This is what it's going to be used for. So you are such leaders in the movement for secularism. For all these reasons, you have to step in and you have to change course. Begin by absolutely rejecting UNICEF. Reject UNICEF. They have the wrong view. They come from a wrong context. It's dangerous for India. And we have to get out of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We should instead have an instrument which applies to South Asian countries and to African countries, people in our stage of development, people from our culture. You guys have to do it. Shanta Sinha and Harsh Mandar, this is on you. Please step up.